The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Staff Sergeant James Connor stood in front of his childhood home. The two-story house looked smaller than he remembered, its white paint slightly faded and the front porch showing signs of age. 3 tours in Afghanistan had changed him, but somehow he had expected everything here to remain exactly the same. James adjusted his army backpack on his shoulder and walked up the creaky steps. The key was right where his mother always kept it, under the ceramic flower pot with a small crack on its rim. A wave of memories hit him as he opened the door. The familiar scent of home, albeit dusty now, brought a lump to his throat. 2 months had passed since his parents' accident. The drunk driver who hit them had taken away James's only family, and now, at 32, he found himself alone in the house where he grew up. The military had been his life for the past 12 years, but after his last tour and his parents' death, he knew it was time to come home. The neighborhood had changed. As James unpacked his few belongings, the roar of motorcycles echoed through the quiet street. He walked to the window and watched as 5 bikers rode past, their engines deliberately loud, causing an old lady across the street to hurry inside her house. This wasn't the peaceful suburb he remembered. That evening, while organizing his father's old study, James heard a gentle knock at the door. Opening it, he found Mrs. Henderson, his former next-door neighbor, holding a casserole dish. Her silver hair was neatly styled, but her hands trembled slightly as she held out the dish. "Welcome home, James," she said, her kind eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry about your parents. They were wonderful people." James took the dish, touched by the familiar gesture. Mrs. Henderson had been bringing over casseroles since he was a kid. They sat on the porch, and Mrs. Henderson filled him in on the neighborhood changes. The Lost Riders, a biker gang, had moved into the area 6 months ago. They'd bought the old Wilson property at the end of the street and turned it into their clubhouse. Since then, peace had become a distant memory. "They party all night?" Mrs. Henderson explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Some of us have tried complaining, but," she glanced nervously down the street, "they can be very persuasive about keeping quiet." James noticed the fear in her voice, so different from the confident woman who used to scold him for running through her flower beds as a child. His military training kicked in as he observed her body language. The way she kept looking over her shoulder, how she flinched at every motorcycle sound. Later that night, James sat in his father's old armchair, his thoughts troubled. The sounds of distant motorcycle engines and loud music drifted through the windows. His training had taught him to assess situations carefully, gather intelligence, and plan accordingly. Something wasn't right in this neighborhood. The next morning, while jogging at dawn, a habit he couldn't break from his military days, James noticed more signs of the gang's influence. Fresh graffiti marked several fences, and broken bottles littered the park where he used to play. An elderly man hurriedly crossed the street when he saw James, clearly mistaking him for one of the bikers due to his muscular build. Back home, James pulled out his laptop and began researching. The Lost Riders had a history in other neighborhoods, starting with minor disturbances, then gradually escalating to more serious issues. Local news articles mentioned suspected connections to drug trafficking, but nothing had ever been proven. As he sat on his porch drinking coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up, James felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd spent years protecting people in far-off lands. Now his own hometown needed protection, but this wasn't a war zone, and he couldn't treat it like one. This situation would require a different kind of strategy. The sound of breaking glass followed by frightened voices caught his attention. Down the street, 2 bikers were knocking over trash cans, laughing as they terrorized a group of schoolchildren waiting for their bus. James set down his coffee cup, his jaw tightening. He had seen enough bullies in his lifetime to recognize them at first glance. The peaceful retirement he had planned would have to wait. First, he had a neighborhood to save. A week had passed since James Connor moved back to his childhood home. Each day, he watched the Lost Riders grow bolder. This morning was no different. From his front window, he observed 3 bikers walking down the street, stopping at each house. They carried leather bags over their shoulders and wore black vests with their gang logo, a skull wrapped in chains. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 3 houses down, answered her door when they knocked. James noticed how her hands shook as she handed them an envelope. The bikers moved on, laughing and counting money. It didn't take his military intelligence training to understand what was happening. They were collecting protection money. Later that afternoon, James was fixing his father's old lawnmower when he heard raised voices. Looking up, he saw the same bikers surrounding Mr. Thompson, the local grocery store owner. Mr. Thompson had his hands raised, trying to explain something. "Please, business has been slow this month," Mr. Thompson pleaded. "I just need more time." The largest biker, who had a red bandana and went by the name Snake, grabbed Mr. Thompson's collar. "Boss doesn't like excuses, old man. You know what happened to the last store that couldn't pay." James remembered that store. The corner market had mysteriously caught fire last month. He set down his tools and walked closer, staying hidden behind Mrs. Henderson's large oak tree. His training had taught him to gather intelligence before acting. "Tomorrow," Snake growled at Mr. Thompson. "We'll be back tomorrow, and you better have our money." He shoved the store owner, making him stumble backward. James waited until the bikers left before approaching Mr. Thompson. The store owner was straightening his glasses, his hands trembling. "Are you okay, sir?" James asked, helping him pick up the scattered groceries. Mr. Thompson looked around nervously. "James? Little James Connor. You've grown so much." He tried to smile but couldn't hide his fear. "It's nothing, just a misunderstanding." "How long has this been going on?" James kept his voice calm and steady. 3 months now." Mr. Thompson sighed. "They started with small demands, free drinks, snacks. Then it became weekly payments for protection. Most of us pay because—" He looked down at his hands. "Well, you saw what happened to the corner market." That evening, James sat on his porch, watching the sunset. The peaceful moment was broken by the roar of motorcycles. A group of riders pulled up at the corner, their bikes deliberately loud. Music blasted from their clubhouse, and the sound of breaking bottles echoed through the street. Mrs. Henderson came out to water her flowers, but quickly retreated when one of the bikers whistled at her. James noticed how she locked her door and pulled all her curtains shut. Using his laptop, James began documenting everything. Times, dates, names, and incidents, just like he'd done during intelligence-gathering missions. He took photos with his phone whenever he could do so safely. The soldier in him knew that information was power. Around midnight, a scream woke him up. James rushed to his window. Across the street, 2 bikers were spray-painting threatening messages on old Mrs. Wilson's garage door. She had been the only one who'd publicly spoken against them at last week's community meeting. James grabbed his phone and recorded the vandalism. His hands tightened into fists, but he remembered his commanding officer's words. "Strategic patience, Connor. Know your enemy before you strike." The next morning, James found Mrs. Henderson crying in her garden. Her beautiful roses had been trampled, and a crude message was sprayed on her fence. "Pay up or else." "I don't have much savings left," she sobbed. "My husband's medical bills took everything, and my pension barely covers food." James helped her clean the fence, his mind working on a plan. The Lost Riders were following a pattern he'd seen before, targeting the vulnerable, using fear as a weapon, escalating gradually. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought they were dealing with ordinary, helpless civilians. What they didn't know was that they had just declared war on someone who'd spent years fighting real battles. And James Connor was about to show them the difference between bullies and real soldiers. The day James Connor had been waiting for arrived sooner than expected. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when he heard Mrs. Henderson's frightened voice from next door. Standing by his window, he watched as 3 bikers from the Lost Riders surrounded her on her own porch. Snake, the biker with the red bandana, towered over Mrs. Henderson. Behind him stood 2 other gang members, a skinny man with a snake tattoo on his neck called Viper, and a heavily built man everyone knew as Tank. "Listen, Grandma," Snake said, poking his finger at Mrs. Henderson's shoulder. "Boss says your time is up. Either you pay double for being late, or we start breaking things." Mrs. Henderson clutched her purse tightly. "Please, I already told you, I don't have any more money. My roses are all I have left from my Henry." Tank laughed and kicked over one of her flower pots. The ceramic pot shattered on the porch, spilling dirt and roses everywhere. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears as she watched her beloved flowers being destroyed. James had seen enough. He stepped out of his house, walking calmly across his lawn to Mrs. Henderson's porch. His military training kicked in automatically, assessed the situation, identified threats, Maintain control. Gentlemen, James said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to giving commands. I believe the lady said no. The three bikers turned to face him. Snake looked James up and down, smirking at his calm demeanor. Well, well, look who decided to play hero. This ain't your business, soldier boy. Mrs. Henderson is my neighbor, James replied, climbing the porch steps. That makes it my business. He positioned himself between the bikers and Mrs. Henderson, who was trembling behind him. You don't know who you're messing with, Viper hissed, pulling out a switchblade. The knife clicked open, catching the afternoon sun. James didn't flinch. His eyes scanned each man, noting their positions, their stances, their weapons, just as he'd done countless times in combat situations. These weren't trained fighters. They were bullies used to intimidating helpless people. Actually, James said, his voice still calm, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. 3 members of the Lost Riders, known for harassing elderly residents and small business owners. You've been operating in this neighborhood for 6 months. He looked directly at Snake. Your real name is Patrick Miller. You spent 2 years in county jail for assault. Snake's smirk vanished. How did you? Tank here is Robert Johnson, wanted in 2 states for extortion. And Viper, or should I say Michael Peters, has an outstanding warrant for drug possession. James took 1 step forward. I've spent the last week documenting everything you do. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every protection payment. It's all recorded. The 3 bikers exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't going according to their usual script. Now, James continued, his voice dropping lower, here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave Mrs. Henderson alone. In fact, you're going to leave everyone in this neighborhood alone. Tank moved forward, cracking his knuckles. Or what, tough guy? James didn't move. Or I send my evidence to every law enforcement agency in the state. I have friends in many places, military police, FBI, state troopers. 1 phone call, and your whole operation comes crashing down. You're bluffing, Snake said, but his voice wavered. Try me. James pulled out his phone. Should I call Captain Martinez at the state police right now? He's on speed dial. The 3 bikers stepped back, their confidence crumbling. They had expected an easy target, not someone who had done his homework and knew how to fight back. This isn't over, Snake growled, but his threat sounded hollow. Yes, it is, James replied. Unless you want to explain to your boss how you got his entire operation exposed. Now leave. The bikers retreated, trying to maintain their tough appearance but clearly shaken. As they walked away, James heard Mrs. Henderson release a shaky breath behind him. Oh, James, she whispered, I haven't seen anyone stand up to them like that. James helped her clean up the broken flower pot. It's not over yet, Mrs. Henderson. They'll be back, but this time they'll bring more men. And when they do, he smiled slightly, remembering his combat instructor's words. The best battles are won before they're fought. When they do, he continued, we'll be ready for them. News of James Connor's confrontation with Snake and his gang spread quickly through the quiet neighborhood. That evening, while James was installing security cameras around his house, he noticed how people watched him from behind their curtains. Some nodded in approval, while others looked worried about what might come next. Around sunset, Mr. Thompson from the grocery store walked over to James's house. He carried a brown paper bag filled with groceries. These are on the house, Mr. Thompson said, his voice low. What you did today, standing up to them, nobody's done that before. He glanced nervously over his shoulder. But be careful. Their leader, they call him Razor. He's different from the others. More dangerous. James accepted the groceries with a thank you, noting how Mr. Thompson hurried back to his store. The old man's fear told James everything he needed to know about this mysterious Razor. Later that night, James sat in his darkened living room, watching through his window. His military training had taught him that after a confrontation, enemies usually react in one of 2 ways. They either retreat or escalate. He was betting on the second option. He didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, the sound of motorcycles broke the neighborhood's silence. This time, it wasn't just 3 bikers. 8 motorcycles pulled up in front of his house. James remained still, watching through his security camera's feed on his laptop. The group was led by a tall man in a leather jacket with silver studs. Even in the dark, the man's presence commanded attention. This had to be Razor. "So this is where our soldier boy lives." Razor's voice carried clearly through James's hidden microphones. "Nice setup he's got here." He pointed at James's security cameras. "Look, boys, he's watching us right now." The gang members laughed, but James noticed they sounded nervous. Snake must have told them about their earlier encounter. Razor walked up to James's front door and knocked loudly. "Come out, soldier. Let's talk like men." James took his time responding. He checked his cameras again. 3 men in the front yard, 2 by the garage, 3 more by their bikes, all armed with chains, bats, or knives. He smiled slightly. They still didn't understand who they were dealing with. Opening his door, James stood calmly in the doorway. The porch light revealed Razor's face, scarred on one side, with cold eyes that had seen their share of violence. "Nice evening for a visit," James said quietly. Razor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you've been causing trouble for my boys. That's bad for business. Threatening elderly women and vandalizing homes is your business." James kept his voice level. "Interesting choice of career." "Listen carefully, soldier boy." Razor stepped closer. "This is our territory. We own this neighborhood. Whatever you think you're doing, it stops now, or things get ugly." James didn't move. "I've seen ugly, Razor. 3 tours in Afghanistan, IEDs, ambushes, real combat." He looked directly into Razor's eyes. "What you do? Bullying old ladies and shopkeepers? That's not ugly, that's just pathetic." Razor's smile vanished. "You think you're tough because you wore a uniform. Out here, different rules apply." "You're right about the rules," James agreed. "That's why I've already sent copies of all my evidence to multiple law enforcement agencies. If anything happens to me or anyone in this neighborhood, it all goes public. Every crime, every threat, every name, including yours, Marcus Razor Rodriguez." Razor's face hardened at the sound of his real name. "Yes, I know who you are," James continued. "Your whole operation, your suppliers, your customers, it's all documented. So here's my counter-offer. Leave this neighborhood alone, or I destroy everything you've built." The other gang members shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to their leader being challenged like this. Razor studied James for a long moment. "You just made a very big mistake, soldier." He turned to leave but stopped. "War? You want war? I'll show you war." As the bikers roared away into the night, James watched through his cameras. He noticed how some of the gang members looked back at his house, their faces showing something new doubt. Inside, James checked his phone. 3 new messages from his old military contacts confirmed they had received his evidence files. Now it was just a matter of time. Mrs. Henderson's voice came from next door. "James? Are you all right?" "Everything's fine, Mrs. Henderson," he called back. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be an interesting day." The next morning, James Connor woke up to chaos. His front yard looked like a war zone. His father's old pickup truck had all its windows smashed. Red spray paint covered his garage door with the words, "Youre dead soldier." Trash was scattered everywhere, and engine oil had been poured over his mother's beloved flower beds. But what made James's jaw tighten wasn't the damage to his property. It was what he saw across the street. Every house on the block had been vandalized with threatening messages. The Lost Riders had made sure the whole neighborhood would blame him for their suffering. Mrs. Henderson came running out of her house, crying, "James, James, they took them." "Took what, Mrs. Henderson?" "My Henry's military medals. They broke into my house while I was sleeping." Her hands shook as she pointed to her broken front window. "Those medals were all I had left of him." James felt something he hadn't experienced since his combat days: cold anger. Taking property was one thing, but stealing a dead veteran's medals? That crossed a line. His phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Like our REDECORATLING, TONIGHD at MIDNIGHD, CLUBHUSD, come alone, or EEMEDLAS get mail TD. Razor." James walked around the neighborhood, documenting the damage. Mr. Thompson's grocery store had its windows broken. The local coffee shop's door was kicked in. Even the small playground had been destroyed, with broken swings and overturned benches. As he took pictures with his phone, James noticed people watching him. Some looked scared, others angry. They blamed him for standing up to the bikers. A rock flew past his head, thrown by someone hidden behind a fence. Back at his house, James sat at his father's old desk and thought about his options. His military training told him this was exactly what Razor wanted: to isolate him, make him desperate, force him into a trap. Around noon, there was a knock at his door. It was Officer Martinez, the local cop who'd been too scared to help before. "Look, Connor," Martinez said, not meeting his eyes. "Maybe you should leave town. These guys, they won't stop. Last guy who stood up to them disappeared." James looked at the young officer. "And that's why you let them take over? Fear." Martinez flushed. "You don't understand. They've got people everywhere. City Hall, police department. Nobody can touch them." "That's where you're wrong," James replied. "Nobody has tried to touch them the right way." After Martinez left, James went to his garage. Behind some old boxes, he found what he was looking for: his father's old ham radio set. As a kid, he'd spent hours learning to use it. Now, it would become part of his plan. Throughout the afternoon, more people visited. Some brought food, others came to complain. An elderly veteran, Mr. Jenkins, arrived with tears in his eyes. "Those medals they stole," he said. "Your neighbor's husband earned them in Vietnam. We served together." He gripped James's hand. "Get them back, son. Some things are sacred." As evening approached, James received another text. 6-8 hours left. Soldier boy, come pray with us at MIDNIGHT. James smiled. Razor thought he was playing psychological warfare, but he'd never faced someone trained in actual warfare. James had spent the day setting up his real plan, and the ham radio was just the beginning. He made one last call to his old army buddy, now working at the state police. "Everything set?" "All units in position," his friend confirmed. "But are you sure about going in alone? These guys are dangerous." "Trust me," James replied. "They think they're setting a trap for me, but in a few hours, they'll learn the difference between criminal intimidation and military strategy." As darkness fell, James watched more bikers gather at their clubhouse. They were getting ready for what they thought would be their victory. Music blasted from their building, and their laughter echoed through the streets. Mrs. Henderson touched his arm. "Please be careful, James. We're not worth dying for." James checked his watch. 6 hours until midnight. "No one's dying tonight, Mrs. Henderson," he said. "But by morning, this neighborhood will be free again. That's a soldier's promise." As the clock ticked closer to midnight, James Connor sat in his father's study, finalizing his plan. The old ham radio crackled with coded messages. Signals passing between retired military veterans he'd contacted throughout the day. Each one had eagerly agreed to help when they heard about the stolen medals. On his laptop screen, 6 different camera feeds showed the area around the Lost Riders clubhouse. James had spent the afternoon secretly placing tiny cameras, skills he learned during covert operations in Afghanistan. He watched as more bikers arrived, their numbers now close to 30. "They're heavily armed," came a whisper through the ham radio. It was Mr. Jenkins, the Vietnam veteran, watching from his position 2 blocks away, counting at least 10 guns, lots of chains and bats. James checked his watch, 10:30 p.m. Everything was going according to plan. He opened a locked box and pulled out a stack of files, the result of weeks of investigation. Each page detailed the Lost Riders' criminal activities: drug deals, money laundering, stolen property. His military intelligence training had taught him that information was the deadliest weapon. A soft knock at his back door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Martinez, looking nervous but determined. "I made some calls," Martinez whispered. "You were right. State police have been building a case against them for months. They just needed someone on the inside to provide evidence." James nodded. "And now they have it. Everything ready on your end?" "SWAT teams are in position. They're just waiting for your signal." Martinez paused. "But Razor's expecting you at midnight. If you don't show up—" "Oh, I'll be there," James replied. "A good soldier never disappoints the enemy." At 11:30 p.m., James started walking toward the clubhouse. The streets were empty, but he could feel eyes watching from behind curtained windows. The entire neighborhood held its breath. The Lost Riders clubhouse was lit up like a carnival, music blasting from speakers. As James approached, the music stopped. Bikers lined both sides of the entrance, creating a path to the front door. Razor stood at the top of the steps, grinning. Right on time, soldier boy. Always so disciplined. He held up something that made James's blood boil. Mrs. Henderson's husband's medals. Looking for these? James climbed the steps slowly, counting under his breath. Through his earpiece, he could hear the positions being confirmed by the hidden veterans around the building. 20 seconds until everything was in place. You know what your problem is, Razor. James spoke loudly, making sure his voice carried to the hidden microphones. You think this is about strength, about who's tougher. Razor laughed. Isn't it? Look around, soldier. You're outnumbered. No backup, no weapons. Just you and your military discipline. He dangled the medals tauntingly. Wrong? James smiled. This is about intelligence, strategy, something they taught us in the army. He pointed to the sky. For example, did you notice the police helicopter that's been circling silently above us for the last hour? Razor's smile faltered as he looked up. Or the SWAT teams that have surrounded this building? James continued. Or maybe the state police units blocking both ends of the street? On cue, floodlights blazed from all directions, illuminating the clubhouse like daylight. The sound of helicopter rotors became deafening as it dropped lower. Right now, James raised his voice over the noise. Every exit is covered, every escape route blocked. All your illegal weapons, drugs, and stolen property are on camera. And thanks to the microphone I'm wearing, we have your confession about the medals, too. Razor's face twisted with rage. He reached for his jacket, but James was faster. Years of combat training kicked in as he grabbed Razor's arm, twisted it behind his back, and smoothly took him down to his knees. Police! Don't move! The shouts came from all directions as SWAT teams rushed in, weapons raised. In the chaos that followed, James calmly picked up the fallen medals. Through his earpiece, he could hear reports from around the neighborhood. North side secured. South entrance clear. All suspects in custody. Officer Martinez appeared, handcuffs ready. The state police want to thank you for your help breaking this case. James watched as Razor and his gang were led away in handcuffs. Just doing what any soldier would do, protecting the home front. The morning after the raid, James Connor stood in front of the Lost Riders clubhouse, now surrounded by yellow police tape. State police vehicles lined the street as officers carried out boxes of evidence. But something didn't feel right. His military instincts were screaming that this wasn't over. We got most of them, Officer Martinez said, walking up to James. But 5 members, including Snake and Tank, weren't at the clubhouse last night. They're still out there somewhere. James nodded, scanning the quiet streets. Years of combat had taught him that the most dangerous moment often came after an apparent victory. They'll be back, he said. Snake won't let this go. His pride won't let him. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you will be own soldier? Meet us at the old factory. 1 hour. Or the whole neighborhood burns. James showed the message to Martinez. The abandoned textile factory on Wilson Street. We can send in a SWAT team, Martinez offered. No, James replied. They'll be watching for police, but I have another idea. Within 30 minutes, James had gathered his own team. Mr. Jenkins and 3 other Vietnam veterans had their old hunting rifles ready. Mrs. Henderson's son, a former Marine, had driven in from 2 states away after hearing about his father's stolen medals. Even Mr. Thompson and several other shopkeepers had volunteered to help. The old textile factory loomed ahead, its broken windows like dark eyes watching them approach. James positioned his volunteers strategically around the building. Through his earpiece, he could hear them reporting in. South entrance covered. Eyes on the loading dock. Roof team in position. James walked alone toward the main entrance. The morning sun cast long shadows through the factory's skeletal frame. As he pushed open the rusty door, the smell of oil and decay hit him. Welcome to your funeral, soldier boy. Snake's voice echoed through the empty building. 5 motorcycles roared to life, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The remaining Lost Riders circled James, their chains driving on the concrete floor. Last chance to leave town. Snake grinned, revving his engine. Otherwise, we burn everything you care about. Starting with that sweet old lady's house next door to yours. James stood calmly in the center of their circle. You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about me. It's about community, something bullies like you will never understand. Tank laughed. Community? Look around. Tough guy, you're alone. Am I? James smiled. Red laser dots suddenly appeared on each biker's chest. Through the broken windows, rifle barrels glinted in the morning light. Remember what I said about having friends in many places? The bikers froze, finally realizing they were surrounded. These men, James continued, are veterans like me. That medal you stole, it belonged to one of their brothers in arms, and we take care of our own. Snake's face twisted with rage. He gunned his motorcycle straight at James, chain swinging. But James was ready. Years of combat training took over. He sidestepped the bike, grabbed the chain, and used Snake's own momentum to pull him off his motorcycle. Snake hit the ground hard as his bike crashed into a wall. The other bikers tried to attack, but shots rang out, hitting the concrete near their wheels. They skidded to a stop, raising their hands in surrender. This is what real warriors look like, James said, standing over Snake. Not thugs who steal medals from widows. Not cowards who threaten old people. Men who fight for something bigger than themselves. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Martinez had been monitoring everything, waiting for the right moment to move in. It's over, James said, picking up Mrs. Henderson's husband's medals from Snake's jacket pocket. The neighborhood isn't yours anymore. It belongs to the people who live there, who care about it. As the police led the last lost riders away in handcuffs, the sun broke fully through the factory's windows. James stood with his improvised team of veterans and shopkeepers, watching the neighborhood's last threats being taken away. Mr. Jenkins patted James's shoulder. You know, son, sometimes the bravest battles aren't fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they're fought right here at home. James looked at the medals in his hand, thinking about all the men and women who'd fought for their homes and communities over the years. The battle might be over, he said, but our job isn't. We've got a neighborhood to rebuild. 1 month had passed since the showdown at the old factory. The quiet neighborhood that James Connor had grown up in was slowly coming back to life. On this sunny Saturday morning, he stood in Mrs. Henderson's garden, helping her plant new roses to replace the ones the bikers had destroyed. These will bloom beautifully by spring, Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes tearing up as she looked at her husband's medals, now safely displayed in a new glass case on her mantel. The medals gleamed in the morning sun, a reminder of both past and recent battles fought for this community. The sound of children playing caught James's attention. Where once there had been only fear and silence, the neighborhood playground now rang with laughter. Mr. Thompson had organized a community fund to repair the damaged equipment, and families were finally letting their children play outside again. The Lost Riders' old clubhouse had been transformed. With help from local authorities and community donations, it was being converted into a veterans support center. James had suggested the idea after learning how many former service members in the area needed help adjusting to civilian life. You know, Mr. Jenkins said, walking up with a tray of lemonade, this reminds me of how neighborhoods used to be. People looking out for each other, not hiding behind locked doors. James nodded, watching as Officer Martinez's patrol car drove by slowly. The young officer waved, no longer the fearful cop who'd once been too scared to challenge the bikers. These days, he regularly attended community meetings and helped organize neighborhood watch programs. The grocery store's bell chimed as Mr. Thompson opened for the day. His windows, once broken by the bikers, now displayed proud signs. Family owned, community strong. Business was better than ever, with people from neighboring areas coming to shop after hearing about how the community had stood up to the gang. James called a voice. It was Mrs. Peterson from down the street. The community center meeting starts in an hour. We need your input on the new security programs. After the incident, James had started teaching self-defense classes for residents and organizing community safety workshops. But more importantly, he'd helped create a support network where neighbors looked out for each other. As he walked to the meeting, James passed his own house. The garage door, once covered in threatening graffiti, now displayed a hand-painted American flag, a gift from the neighborhood children. His father's old pickup truck had been repaired by local mechanics who refused to accept payment, saying they were just paying it forward. The community center was packed. Faces that had once been marked by fear now showed confidence and pride. On the walls hung photos of the neighborhood's transformation, before and after pictures that told the story of revival. "Before we start," announced Mrs. Henderson, who had become the community board president, "I'd like to share some news. The state prosecutor called this morning. Razor and his entire gang have pleaded guilty. With the evidence James helped collect, they're facing long sentences. They won't be troubling any other neighborhoods for a very long time." Applause filled the room. James sat quietly in the back, remembering his father's words. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that bring people together. The meeting discussed plans for a community garden, after-school programs for kids, and a new emergency response system. What had started as a fight against criminals had become something more, a revival of community spirit. After the meeting, James walked home with Mrs. Henderson. "You know," she said, "when you first came back, I worried you brought the war home with you, but instead, you brought back something we'd lost: courage to stand together." James smiled, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in warm colors. His military training had taught him how to fight, but it had also taught him the importance of protecting what matters. In Afghanistan, he'd fought for abstract ideas of freedom and safety. Here, he'd fought for something you could see and touch: a community's right to live without fear. As evening fell, neighbors sat on their porches, children played in yards, and the sound of friendly conversations filled the air. The Lost Riders were gone, but they'd left something unexpected behind: a stronger, more united neighborhood. James sat on his own porch, enjoying the peaceful scene. Tomorrow, he would start teaching another self-defense class, continue working on the Veterans Center, and help plan the neighborhood's first community festival. The soldier in him had found a new mission: not fighting wars, but building peace, one neighborhood at a time.